Hey, how's everybody doing? Let's start this off by moving the camera so that it's this way. Thank you for joining the second studio visit of the day today. I hope that you get to experience getting out of your house and looking at your screen and going into a new space. Today's second visit is going to be with Christian Ramirez, who is going to join us shortly. He has a studio in Santa Ana, California, in the Santora building. It's a real famous building in Santa Ana. It's very beautiful, and a space that has lots of galleries within it, and as well as studio space. And he'll give us a tour as soon as he joins the chat. Let me send him a message. And but yeah, in the meantime, if you didn't get to see what's going on over here in my studio here, I can turn this around. This is a work by Hannah Perez, and it's a real cool collaboration that we did, and some cutouts. This has some Mylar. Let's see if we can join this guy. Yeah, there we are. So that's going to be a real positive thing. This is this painting I did with Jocelyn Casas. All right. Hey, how you doing, Christian? We move to the left here. Flip this around.
What's up, Jorge?
How you doing, man? Great to see you.
Doing all right. How about yourself?
I'm doing all right. Thanks a lot for making time today.
Yeah, that was a great chat you had with Steven earlier. Enjoyed tuning in for that.
Oh, I'm so glad. The idea is to try to, activate our social media interactions and be able to expose what you're doing to other people, and use that as a platform to grow.
Cool. Awesome.
So Christian, how do we know each other?
So about, 5-6 years ago, I'd applied to grad school. I got an interview for Yale's MFA program, and so I kind of panicked, if I recall correctly. Did some local artist searches, looking for someone who might have had like a similar, background, Latino from Southern California, just to get some feedback on what to expect. And I think, if I recall correctly, it seemed like you were a little reticent or hesitant. Didn't know who I was. I was a complete stranger, kind of cold calling you. But then from then on, I think we developed a friendship that got strengthened through our spaces. I was inspired by your project space, kind of started basement projects soon after that. And then our friendship just developed over that time period. It also turned out that you just happened to know some people I knew through my admissions work at the college. People like Steven, for example.
Absolutely. It was nice that we had overlap, but really what made our friendship be so successful is the fact that we have some mutual admiration for our practice. I know that we've had many studio visits since we've known each other, and every single time I leave your studio feeling like I learned something about painting, and sometimes I feel like I feel like my love for moving paint around with a brush is rekindled when I'm like in your studio, because you have such a wonderful joy of moving paint with your brush. It's like not everybody gets a lot of joy out of moving paint with a brush, but your paintings tend to have this residue of the paintbrush that I feel is such a rich quality that not everybody gets to. But so how long have you been
appreciate you saying
painting?
that. Appreciate you saying that.
Of course.
I graduated my undergrad in 2008. So I've been painting for about 4 or 5 years then, through kind of training methodology, and then since then I've been painting. So I kind of usually say at this point, and that's when I started to feel. I say 12 years just because that's when I started to feel really comfortable with the material. Or at least I would say a more serious investigation with the material. So it's been about a dozen years, I would say, of like professional, what I would consider more professional kind of painting post-training.
That's interesting because I think one of the things about your paintings is that they definitely show an excavation of the surfaces, and it's like a reverse excavation because you're building layers and then you scrape off layers and then you go back into it, and like that struggle of painting is always like left on the surface, which I really appreciate. And since you've been doing it for so long, there's like there's a very subtle and obvious gesture, so there's subtle gestures, but there's like an obvious intent in all of that subtlety, which I think is very clever. How about you show us around your studio to see what your paintings look like, so that everybody.
Yeah. So right, I also run a project space, the paint, or co-run now, the painter's room. And so the idea was that in May I was going to have kind of a solo show, almost like an early retrospective of just the kind of work I've been doing for the last, I shouldn't really call it retrospective, but kind of a culmination of all the work I've been doing in the last 3 years, which constitutes a new body of work. Now with the coronavirus issues, quarantine and all that, that show is on indefinite postponement. And so a lot of the work is actually in the adjacent gallery across the way. So a lot of the work I've been doing in the last 3 years is mostly lined up on the walls over there. So we could walk over there and show that space if you want, or do you want to look at this space first?
Let's look at your space first.
All right.
Let's see what your cave of painting and making art is first, and then we can go over there.
I was talking to my contact at MSU, where I am supposed to be attending for my MFA in the fall.
Congratulations for getting into grad school, by the way.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Proud of you.
Thank you.
I think that takes that insight into like painting to a whole new level. You go there for 3 years, right?
Yeah, it's a 3-year fully funded program. So it's an opportunity to kind of explore other media. When you're working a full-time job, it limits your ability to experiment and try out new medias that maybe you're not as familiar with. It takes time to, especially me, because I very much do care about kind of the craft, and I think that's something you were speaking to earlier in terms of the body and surface of the paintings. So there's a lot of intention.
Could you show us some examples of how you do that with your painting surfaces?
Yeah, we could look at it closely. It kind of requires, I guess, a little bit of an explanation that I was trained at a very academic art school in terms of kind of classical portraiture, figuration, a very kind of conventional art program, conventional forms, conventional space, conventional paintings. And so post-graduation, I realized I always needed some kind of referent to paint from, either a live model, a still life, or a photograph. And then so I embarked on a journey of trying to relearn how to paint. And so at some point, I basically focused on abstract painting and rebuilt my techniques. I had such a formulaic approach to painting. I knew exactly how to get the results I wanted, and then it was just a matter of improving and getting better over time, like John Curran or something, where it's just technical mastery. You kind of keep building that. And that wasn't the path I was interested in, so I painted abstract for a few years. And in doing so, you learn a whole array of other skills and ways of generating not only content or the work, through automatic drawing and other techniques, but then also your paint application.
What painters were you looking at to, develop a visual vocabulary of your painting techniques?
I think it was more looking at a certain kind of approach and freedom. It's like you learn, through my undergraduate painting practice, I learned how to build the box really well, really well. And then it's a matter of like, oh, well, what do you want to build besides a box, And so then you kind of dismantle the tools and then rebuild. And so I think the person I was looking at a lot is kind of a cliche, but de Kooning. De Kooning had a figurative background. He was a craftsperson, a trained illustrator, and it wasn't, it was over years of observation and experimentation that he developed his work that we know him for. And so I think seeing the freedom and realizing that you kind of know the end goals. I know how to create a form. I know how to create a space. I know how to create layered space, et cetera. There's all these things that you know how to do, and then it's a matter of, well, are there different ways to get there? Are there different routes to get to that, to achieve that? And so that way, along the way, you end up with surprises, whether they're accidents, whether they're mistakes that you're trying to correct over. Go on.
Can you show us some examples of that in your work in your studio?
Yeah, so I think if I look at for example, this funny self-portrait I've been doing, hard to see because of the glare. One of the things that I've picked up is this idea of kind of an abstract composition, and this is the idea that the composition isn't just the arrangement of forms and where they are, which is oftentimes kind of what we think about in terms of composition. But then you have what I might refer to as an abstract composition. So the way in which the light structure creates a secondary kind of composition. If we go to the other studio or the gallery, I have pieces where I can kind of compare a little bit more specifically. But so for example, I have a series of these cauliflower head kind of portrait fighters, and so this is one I started yesterday. And it's this pretty simple template in that I'm just essentially painting a portrait, but each portrait then becomes a question. So how do I approach this new painting in a different way?
Just so that we can see your paintings a little more, would you mind switching the camera so that we can get close to the painting and see the surfaces?
Switch sides here.
Yeah, there we are. Yeah, look at how beautiful that is. Wow. So that's a oil paint applied with a brush?
Mostly a brush in like what I refer to as like a dab and plot technique. So there was a period of time where when I was painting figurative paintings, I was really into a painter named Anne Gale, who, kind of a part of this like perceptual school of painting. So, I also liked Antonio Lopez Garcia, still do very much. And so kind of like a pointillist type of approach to painting where you're essentially plotting a mark and then, each mark becomes a part of the drawing as well. And so going into each one of these portrait paintings, which I could show a whole series of them in the other gallery, there's usually they kind of behave like hangers for an idea or for an approach of painting. And so in this case, I hadn't done another one of these in a while. And so I didn't necessarily know what the painting was going to be. And so I just decided to allow it to emerge from a field of paint. And so looking at like Bernard or someone Vuillard, someone like that, and then just plotting marks and creating a color field, and then trying to allow the figure to emerge without like a specific predetermined goal, like maybe some of the other portraits might be approached. I might have a flash of an idea in my head, a visual idea, and try to go for that, or I might just approach it from a point of technique like this one. Yeah.
I do notice that in your work, there's always like a struggle that's visually like stark. Can you show someone that struggle in like maybe this larger painting and how like it changes between like your high tones and low tones?
Yeah, that part. So I do start usually with some kind of idea of sometimes based on a drawing. I might have a quick sketch or a drawing, but I won't project that drawing in any way to the canvas, and instead I kind of try to start from scratch. It's almost like exercising. I kind of exercise the ideas before then going to the final piece, so that along the way as I make the painting, I make discoveries and figure out the painting. If I've already figured out the painting before I'm painting it, I feel there's no desire to paint it at that point. It kind of becomes an illustration. It becomes, okay, here's the drawing, and let me just color it in. And so in this case, I didn't necessarily. So in this case, a big change that happened was this yellow passage here, which kind of is supposed to represent some kind of lake or river. That was all purple and red. And so what ended up happening is you just had a big mass of purple-red painting with just the yellow at the top of the horizon. And at some point, I realized I needed to silhouette that mound that they're building to give the form more presence. So, that one was kind of just a basic, compositional choice. And so I just went in, and you could kind of see some of the layering there. I just went in and painted the reflection of the sky into some kind of lake or river, which then makes sense thematically because they're building another one of themselves next to some kind of water source. The mountain also took a lot of kind of rebuilding and redrawing. I hadn't completely established how this guy was going to look. So I actually repainted his entire lower half You kind of see some of the, what do they call it, pedimento. So that's down there. You can kind of see
what is that? What does that technical term mean?
it basically just means where you can see the layer of paint from the previous drawing. So there you see that the knee used to drop all the way down there, but about another 4 inches down, and move that up. So again, for me, the paintings have to be in a way that, you know, psychologically they're doing something for me, in that, you know, I'm kind of navigating this space of anxiety. But then they also have to do something for me in terms of creative, in terms of making them. You know, I think you're right that there's a struggle, but it's not necessarily like the tortured romantic artist struggle. It's more of an analytical, you know, what is working, what is not, and let's do the work that needs to be done.
There's some moves in this painting that when you're far from it, you don't appreciate, but when you get close to it, they just become so spectacular. In particular, that green hue that you added in order to create a border between the yellow, and then how you transition that same color to have like 2 different tones and to complement like the color of the bodies. Do you practice those color combinations on another sheet before you apply them, or do you just go onto the canvas and then just like trial and error it on there?
A lot of it is trial and error, but a lot of it is also just cumulative experience. So for the most part, I work with a full spectrum palette, meaning that I have colors.
Wow, look at all that paint.
Yeah, and I have a shipment coming in this week of paint. And so then it comes out of just a basic knowledge of how color mixes. So I don't have to have predetermined kind of like palette or anything. And instead I squeeze out colors I need, I mix the colors, and I paint and experiment. I'm also really into the idea that these paintings are not perfect. And so sometimes, you know, you paint a passage and you run out of paint, and then you got to make another batch of that paint. And it doesn't always, you know, line up as the exact same color. And for me, that's fine. And in fact, it kind of reminds me of graffiti abatement when you see, you know, walls that have been graffitied over several times and they've tried to repaint. So, you know, something about the history of painting, the history of the painting. You know, so I'm a very direct painter. And in fact, in some cases, you can see that I'm just mixing right on the surface too.
Now I see a lot of references to like these Danish Schultz kind of like color contrasts and like these gestures that she makes that I see in your work. Is there a reference there that you're working with, or am I just kind of imposing that?
Well, I think with any kind of contemporary figurative painter at that stature, it's almost impossible to ignore. And in fact, the self-portrait, here, let me flip it again. The self-portrait here is kind of in reference to, so I have a little, you know, kind of like a painter group of friends. It's kind of referencing this idea that we refer to as the graphic design bodies. And that's the trend in figurative painting that we're seeing right now, in which the figures are distorted in such a way as to kind of remind us of the flatness of the picture plane and the boundaries of the picture plane. And Dana Schutz does that quite a bit, as do a lot of other figurative painters. And so I like the idea that I was kind of riffing on that. So in a way, this is kind of a paint. I started this painting in 2017. It looked very different. It was actually a desert landscape before at night. And then I lightened it up, made it a beach painting during, you know, sunset or something. But the idea is that I'm trapped in the painting. You know, it's like I'm stuck by the boundaries of the painting. But I'm also doing, I think, other things that maybe those other painters are necessarily not doing. So.
You know what? I was going to ask you about this purple line that goes over to the what I see on the left side, and how like it feels kind of like it's smoke. Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's definitely smoke. How wonderful. Yeah. Can you follow that line up the rim of the painting? Wow. Yeah, that's really cool. I love how it traces around the top corner and it cuts the panorama.
Yeah,
what type of thinking led you to make that decision?
It's a bit of a carryover from the abstract paintings I was painting. When I was thinking about the abstract paintings, I kept thinking a lot about interfaces. So you know, right now we interface a lot with digital media, And so oftentimes the borders of things are either overlapping each other in a, in a stacked window situation, or you have, menus, your menu screen at the bottom of, your window browser, things like that. And so when I was painting the abstract paintings, I kept thinking a lot about the boundaries and the edges quite a bit. And I would do things like these kind of like stacked or layered or almost cut relief edges. And so that's kind of what's going on in this piece. It was in a way to make the design more interesting. But then also, originally I had this idea that I might extend this canvas all the way out that way and that way. And so then you'd end up with like a before and after. And I had this idea that I would paint this whole other canvas in a limited palette of purples, just like a value painting in purples.
Let me ask you, you were talking about the graphic quality of the figures that you've been working on. Do you have any of your sketches to kind of help emphasize how you work out the illustration and the composition?
My sketches tend to be a lot looser than that. They tend to, so again, part of the reason why I don't make those decisions beforehand is because we're dealing with also scale. So sometimes, these paintings, I won't know how they're going to read until we've started to make them. So for example, this one, as soon as I put it on the canvas, I realized that the scale was reading differently at that size than it was at the drawing, in the drawing. And it appears that the viewer is a lot closer. If you stand in front of this painting in person, you feel like you're right on top of the scene. Versus in the drawing, based on where the picture plane kind of began at the bottom, you felt like it was at a distance. So again, a lot of the decisions are made afterwards. So if I just go through some of these drawings.
That's such a good point to bring up about how the scale of something changes your perspective, because I always think about that with regards to hands. So I really hate drawing or painting figures, but there's something about it because when you start to work with hands, like it has to be not huge, and it can't be bigger than the face, but it has to be bigger than your nose, etc. And it's just like, it just drives me crazy.
Yeah, no, totally. And size and scale is is probably the thing I've been most obsessed with lately, and largely because I'm able to paint big. I have this bigger studio, and so there's the original drawing that it's kind of based on, and you could kind of compare and contrast here that. That floor plane is significantly lower in this painting, or drawing, than it is in the painting. And so then you end up with a situation where it's like, okay, well, that's what's on the canvas now. Do I need to adjust it, or do I work with what's there?
If anybody wants to ask any questions, feel free to ask while we're talking. Any input is totally valid. I wanted to ask you something in regards to your figures. They have this golem shape. Is there a metaphor in that way that I'm missing, or is there?
What kind of shape did you say?
They look like they're like golems or something like that. Like they don't necessarily have a human figure. They have like something else going on.
Yeah, they're definitely riffing on the golem motif. They're technically not golems in that traditionally a golem is created by a human. And then animated through some kind of word, magic via word, so via text. And so in my interpretation or use of them, they are golems, but they're self-replicating. And so they build each other, they make each other.
Are they like gremlins?
Maybe not.
No.
No, and the forms, they really just come out of looking at painters that I like that are dealing with similar subject. So looking at Enzor, for example, James Enzor, or looking at Philip Guston, or looking at Goya.
That Guston reference, I think that these series of paintings that you have with bones is really spectacular. Just so you know, especially because you do this thing that like Wayne Thiebaud does in like creating color contrasts that help create a visual reverberance between the two colors.
Yeah.
And I remember like going to your studio some time ago, and just seeing you struggle on how to create like the right color combination to make this purple pop out. It was just like it was eye opening to see this, like how eloquent the actual painting turned out at the end.
Yeah, and I think the Wayne Thiebaud thing comes out of a couple of things. First, when I ask myself why did I want to become a painter, it happened in community college, and I had just fallen in love with Van Gogh and Gauguin, and it was primarily their use of color, especially Gauguin and the pink sky paintings that he was doing. I forget in which area he was at that point, but he has a series of paintings where he's doing with pink and orange kind of sherbet sky.
Oh, he's in Tahiti?
It might have been the Tahiti stage. I forget if it was. I know he was in a couple of different places.
French Polynesia, right? He was in French Polynesia, right?
Yeah. And character aside, I still think his paintings are beautiful.
Character aside, let's put that asterisk there because it's okay.
And so what had occurred is after I graduated my undergrad, I felt that my color was completely gone. It was like Brown School of Painting. I feel like at that point. And so I spent years trying to rebuild my rebuild my understanding of color. But it also turns out that my mentor, Randall Cabe, was a student of Wayne Thiebaud, went to UC Davis in the 90s. And then my good friend Vaughn Sumner was also a student of Wayne Thiebaud's, and he actually went to school in his undergrad with him, in addition to also going to grad school under Wayne Thiebaud. So I have a big connection to the Bay Area.
It's such a gem of a painter. Like, I mean, obviously we would think about him in like these paintings of cakes or hills, but then he has these series of paintings of nurses that just like they're just so jaw dropping. Like if I could have like a goal, it would be to like own one of those nurse paintings.
Yeah.
I just like love how like the paint is caked on so heavily. And
right.
Somehow the control of the brush to add color over that is just I don't know, it's breathtaking.
And I've always gravitated towards an artist I should say a painter. But this goes not just painting, but where you see the process of the making, whether it's just a side effect of the making of the painting or part of the work itself. I guess it's hard to separate those two things, but I think of someone like Amy Sillman, who's probably my favorite living painter. The gesture in her work, the time that's in her, the time is something I've been thinking about a lot in painting recently. But the kind of different times that she's able to kind of show in a painting is pretty remarkable, I think. But also just seeing, she's also struggling, but it's not like, again, it's not like that old romantic Cedar Tavern, struggling artist, or tortured artist, Van Gogh. It's none of that. It's more of a playful struggle. It's you're play wrestling, you're mud wrestling, and you may get frustrated, but there's still it's about kind of the joy of like you said earlier, to begin with, the joy of moving paint around and being in a material body and moving material to create new bodies. To me, that's what interests.
I wanted to just echo how I too admire Amy Sillman, because her paintings they really are just like incredibly like dense, like how many layers and layers and layers of painting of just like pigment over pigment over pigment, and then the scraping of all that shit just to start over. Like one canvas will have like 20 compositions, and you won't even appreciate it because you don't see them. But she has like time-lapse photos of that canvas in its transition. Those time-lapse photos are just incredible. You're just like jaw-dropping.
Yeah, have you seen the animations she's done?
You know what? I don't think I know the animations. I know that there's these videos of the paintings as they move forward, and that's always been interesting. What are the animations like?
Well, she does digital animations, because she does a lot of drawing on iPads and so forth.
Oh wow!
So she'll actually animate those. You can do like the layer animation. It's not like animation in 24 frames per second type of animation. It's more like steps in a painting animation.
Then yes.
And they're great. Yeah.
Yeah.
And she'll even print out stills from those sessions or from those animations. Are great. She also has a wonderful essay, or she did a lecture. I forget where at. You can find it on YouTube. It's about a 45-minute lecture just on color. These are all drawings. These are all drawings I was doing from like a samurai hand-to-hand combat book that I have lying around.
So when you do these drawings, are you using ink and a branch?
And these ones, these are just Copic markers. Those ones there. But I draw it with a lot of different materials. This is just, yeah, these are just Copic markers, right?
Yeah, that fucking alcohol-based ink.
Yeah, that's what you can kind of see it.
And it just goes into the fibers. And just
yeah, you can see it.
I get a real fixation with those things. Yeah, it's good.
Yeah. But I'll draw with anything. I'll draw with, ink. I'll draw with color pencils. I'm not too picky. Got some other pieces. But right now, I'm kind of, I'm working on this guy. And then lately I've been thinking about these bone, like you were saying, the bone machines. I'm trying to think about how to paint them. And so I've been focused a lot on drawing during quarantine, working at home, drawing in between my remote working job, et cetera. And I haven't figured out how to implement these as paintings yet. I had this one that I kind of experimented with and I've been playing around with, kind of a little bit of an outlier. What was that?
Can you get close to that painting?
Yeah, and this is just some Yupo paper that I had in which I was working on some other projects, and so I ended up with a bunch of green on the Yupo paper. Worked out some
over
kind
the
of
painting, or is that buried? Is that buried and then covered over with paint?
It's just glued right on top right now.
Oh.
So
that contrast is real nice. I like how the gray and the dark really make the green pop out.
Yeah, and so in this one, I was thinking, I had this black and white kind of bone machine with one of the skin flags on it, but it wasn't really activated. It felt kind of boring. It felt dull, and so I then had this idea of this green flame that I had introduced in another painting. Largely because I needed an excuse to get green into these paintings. I hadn't had green in them yet. And so I thought of the idea of using the flame as more of an icon. And so versus, a more naturalistic kind of introduction of a green flame in this painting. And so I was playing around with the idea of like this kind of symbol image, et cetera, and then stumbled upon this more kind of like silhouetted. It's like a head that's silhouetted in a way. But again, I'm still. What was that?
It's gonna be silly, but it reminds me of that scene in Game of Thrones where they throw the fire water or dragon water, and then they explode all those.
Yeah, and that's something I've been thinking about, because one of the things we haven't talked about is that the paintings themselves. And I wish I had better service. It just occurred to me that if we went into that other room, my service would probably die.
I thought about that too.
Yeah. So part of this is it's really a world building practice. I'm sorry. What was that?
Do you get service in the other room?
Not really. You know how it is. You've been in there.
I have.
Yeah.
Well, you know what?
Yeah.
We'll do a video of it and we'll post it on the Cactus account so that you can see it later.
Yeah. So like you were saying, the magic. The kind of magic, what is it, Dragonfire they refer to it as in Game of Thrones?
Dragonfire, that's what's up, yeah.
So this whole thing has been like a process of world building, at least the current body of work. And so, not only do the paintings have to kind of make sense to me as paintings, meaning that the next painting kind of has to be reacting to the other paintings, and they all have to function as paintings for me. And so there is this other aspect to the work that's kind of a world building process, a process of building out characters, environments, maybe the actions and the things that they're involved in. So whether it's, building another golem or eating each other, which is in one of the other paintings, there's one of these golem characters is eating a corpse of another one. So they kind of eat each other, they fight each other, and then they rebuild each other. So kind of it's kind of this cycle. And as I stated earlier, I wanted to get green into these paintings, and so far the world is desolate. There's no, there doesn't appear to be any fauna in this world that I'm developing, and so green hasn't been introduced other than in the brown spectrum. like the one right behind me. That figure has some green in it. But truly vibrant green, which, I love CAD green, I love, really bright, intense color, has been hard to introduce until I developed, but I had an idea for a kind of emerald flame painting. And so I painted that, and that then introduced the color green into the rest of the world. And so when I was playing with the color choice, it was really formal. It was like, okay, the painting is red. What, it's going to be, I've already been using red let me backtrack. I had the idea of a flame and a skull, pretty basic idea, but it needed to kind of fit into the rest of the world. And so I've been using red a lot. I needed green, and so I couldn't do another red flame, which traditionally flames are red, orange, etc. And so then the idea of bringing in the opposite color, essentially a green, and then that aligned perfectly with our representations of magic, right? If we play video games, it's either green or purple flames that represents magic. You watch a show like Game of Thrones, same thing. And so green or blue or purple flames often denote a type of magic or a type of infused type of thing, And so in the works, then the green comes to represent a type of animation, a type of sentience, a type of intelligence, or a type of magic, type of spirituality.
So, Christian, when you had the show at Cactus, there was a combination of paintings that showed the cauliflower ears, and then there was some studies that were adjacent to those cauliflower ear paintings. Does that mean that, like, when you're making paintings, you do like warm-ups or rehearsals in order to get to like troubleshoot certain ideas within your paintings?
Sometimes. It kind of, I think it depends. I think to me, the research, the biggest part of the research for painting is drawing. And to me, it's like you're exercising a muscle. The drawing is a generation machine. It generates ideas for me. It generates, the content. And so that becomes the research. And then, of course, everything else I'm funneling into myself. So if you think, I think about myself, my entire being is part of this artist machine. And so whatever I'm filling it in with, so I tend to watch movies, I tend to read books that are associated with my interests in the studio also. So that everything that I'm ingesting, even the music, is in some way eventually going to kind of find its way into the paintings. And so the drawing sometimes is a practice to do something. So for example, in that case, I kept repeatedly drawing this head because I only had 4 sheets of BFK paper. And I wanted to do these really clean, like nice gestural drawings, but I wanted them to look specific. They couldn't look, haphazard. And so I drew the same drawing over maybe 90 times before then pulling out the good paper and drawing it, and 2 of them came out fine, the other 2 I failed. I should say they didn't come out right. And so then with those 2, what was that?
After you finished, I'm sorry.
No. And so with those, I just put them aside, and then those might become part of another piece later. I might use them as like the basis for something else. So.
Those charcoal rehearsals of those faces are spectacular, by the way.
Thanks.
My parents have one.
Yeah.
And they put it in their door right above the peephole. And for a while, my mom was not that fond of it, for whatever reason. But then what happened is that she learned to appreciate it, and now she really likes it. And so it's really wonderful to to see how my mom's appreciation of that rehearsed poetic gesture was something that she found an admiration for at the end. And I thought that, I definitely wanted to share that with you.
Thank you.
Because,
Yeah, I guess the intention was partly, rehearsal, but then it's like, how do I, like you said, gesture, there's a gesture in it. And when I was drawing those, I was drawing them large enough so that you draw with the whole arm in those cases. And so then to me, it became like, how do I fit the whole body into just a head and just in as few lines as possible? And whether that was successful or not is a different thing, but I think the drawings ended up nice, I thought.
So Christian, first of all, thanks for hosting us in your studio and allowing everybody to see what your process is. Let me ask you, now that we're like 40 minutes into this, what has been what as an artist during this time of quarantine, how have you been, dealing with your studio practice, and if you could share like your hardships with them?
So, first things first, I'm pretty lucky in that I have, a home space, an apartment, and then I also have a work studio. So I'm not stuck in one space. I have another space where I can go work. And that's, I understand there's a certain amount of privilege to that experience. In addition to that, I also have a full-time stable job that I can do remotely. So those two combined definitely makes it probably a lot easier for me to maintain my studio practice than a lot of other people. That being said, of course, there's still, a lot of issues that arise trying to work under these circumstances. And I think one of those is that, I've been accepted to MSU, and I was, I'm planning to attend there in the fall.
Michigan State University, right?
Yeah, Michigan State University. And so I was prepared to kind of wrap up these big paintings, do this exhibition, start packing up, cleaning up, and maybe doing some smaller works. But now I find myself in a little bit of a limbo stage where I've kind of wrapped up the big paintings, so I don't want to start anything new that's big, for a lot of different reasons. But I also don't have a specific, I have a couple of specific series that I would like to dedicate. Like I have an idea for doing a series of these bone machine paintings. I have a few other ideas, but I don't feel that I have adequate time to kind of settle into them and really give them the time they need. And so what's ended up happening is I've resorted again, just mostly to drawing, and some of the other areas of my practice that maybe weren't as robust. So I've been doing.
Whoa, sorry about this delay. I don't know what's going on here.
Sorry, it cut out a little bit there.
I don't know.
No, I got my notification that I'm overdue on my social media usage today.
Today's the day.
So, so I've been mostly reading a lot more than I usually do, and a variety of different types of books. And I've been drawing a lot more. So that's how I've mostly been dealing with the quarantine stuff. I'm used to being alone. I'm used to being in the studio anyways. I miss my family. That's probably the thing I miss the most. I miss seeing some of my friends, visiting studios and so forth. But for the most part, whereas I used to always have a podcast on in here, I've noticed that since this kind of quarantine stuff has come up and we're all in this kind of state of anxiety, I've been listening to a lot less podcasts. I've tuned out. While everybody's tuned in more, I've tuned out more. And then, because I'm usually so tuned in, I couldn't deal with it. So I kind of had to pull back a little bit from the amount of news intake. I haven't even been able to follow up on some of the other kind of theories about what's going on right now, et cetera, that I normally would be up to date on.
It's so challenging. It's so challenging right now to try to keep like your ear on the ground, because I feel like the stories don't get better, one, and two, like there's just like this redundancy to the status of the situation that just kind of triggers the anxiety a little more than I wanted to, or like it's just not healthy for me. Like I definitely find myself like in the middle of the day, just out of nowhere, just kind of taking a moment to pause and then just like breathing into like, oh man, like I gotta wear a mask now when I leave, or like I can't touch things with my hands, and it's just like that subtle change in my behavior is like a recognition of the sadness that we're dealing with. And I think that the news just kind of like augments that to a degree where it becomes unhealthy. So I echo this idea of like just putting the podcast to the side and just finding a time in the day to like swallow that shit and then just like move on forward, because where before like the news would be a little bit different, like in showing you different sides of the world, like we're all on the same page now.
Yep. Yeah. And I'm so used to being a little bit more tuned in than the people around me. So just, again, it's just one of my interests, but right now it's an interest that I'm kind of putting aside. And it's amazing how much, I'll be I'll feel really anxious, and I could feel it building through the day. And then as soon as I sit down and then I just start reading a book, like almost immediately, those anxiety levels drop. And it's a reminder that like you still have these spaces inside that, you know, are safe. And, you know, and so, you know, how do we activate those spaces? And so for the longest time, I've been, you know, just generating ideas through either drawing or through reading. So
That's good, man. How do you start your paintings in the studio?
how are you, I want to ask, how are you doing? You know, your practice involves collaboration and travel so much. I can only imagine, you know, how you're having to deal with these times.
You know what? It's real interesting because I teach at public schools and I work side gigs, like working at events and, you know, doing Lyft and just trying to pay my bills in that way. Everything has come to a standstill. I've had to file for unemployment and, you know, pay my bills that way. Luckily, I applied before the spike hit, and so I'm all right now. Everything's, you know, in its course to, you know, help me find some stability. But, you know, I think as time moves on, I'm sure that, you know, physically I'll be feeling some pain in a few months. And as far as my collaborations with other people, I had to take a step back because before it was very hands-on, like let's meet together, let's draw for an hour, 2 hours, let's try some different things. Great shot. But it hasn't dampened my spirits in being able to collaborate because what transpired over the last few years in like developing relationships with other artists is this dialogue, this visual dialogue, like going into a studio. And so I think virtually you can get as much done as you can in person. The difference is that when it comes to like physically making something, that needs to happen in another way. And so it's been a damper in that like I can't feel the presence of another person in the same room in the same way that it was before. You know, like I would be far more gregarious about going to another person's studio, where now it's like, I don't know, you know, like I had like a studio visit lined up for like the week of the first quarantine, and I was like, well, let's play this one by ear, and maybe we can do it virtually or something like that. And so I had to like put a tack on some of the visits that I had coming to the studio here. But, you know, Cactus is looking to do this virtual thing for a little bit, and hopefully something else comes out.
Cool. I think it's great. I think it's a great idea.
Thanks. I'm real glad I get to see your work and be around your paintings a little bit, even if it's remotely.
Thanks.
Also, to congratulate you on your admissions to grad school and this new move that you're going to go on. So you've been doing a lot of drawings at home. Is that what's up, or have you been going?
Yeah,
to your studio
mostly at home. I'll come to the studio too, but most of the drawings are done at home. And that's where I was like, you know, and again, that's where, you know, I think because I love painting so much and because I know how to paint, there's a tendency to sometimes paint too fast. So it's like, oh, I got another idea. Let me paint it how I painted the other paintings. I got another idea. Let me paint it like the last painting. And I might change up, you know, maybe some of the formal questions, you know, I might complicate it. I might throw a wrench in it, whatever. But the reality is I start to fall in, I realize I have a natural habit to start to fall into practices, or I shouldn't say practices, but methodologies. And so in drawing, because I have a really clean bone machine painting that I really like. I posted it today against the wall outside of the building. It's like got a blue background, it's got a bone machine, really like a bone sculpture with a flag on it. And I like that painting, but I wouldn't paint another one like that. I wouldn't paint another one of those like that. Because then it starts to feel rote. It starts to feel, I'm already bored of it before I even started painting it. And so then I had to come back to the drawings. I've been drawing, and I came to the realization that the reason why I like the drawings is that they're puzzles. I set up a certain kind of rule system for myself, and then I just draw out these simple, and when I talk about those, I'm referring to these bone machines. I have a big one right here, or a bigger one.
That's such an academic approach towards making work.
Yeah, so these become, you know, so I've been doing a bunch of these, and then I'm realizing that it's not that I care about the bone machines. I like them as an idea, and in my mind they kind of mean something, and in the context of the rest of the work they mean stuff. but it's not that I want to paint the bone machines. And in reality, what it is, I like the puzzle of making this kind of balanced, this unbalanced, balanced drawing. And so then I'm rethinking about how do I approach them as paintings, and how do I paint these differently, so that the form and the methodology of the painting is related also to the interest in them and why, rather than just re-representing them in different ways.
So let me ask you, how do you anticipate going to grad school and bringing this particular question to the forum? Like, do you feel like there's like a forecast that you're expecting, or a direction that you would like to go to, or is it completely unexpected where you're going to go?
I don't think it's unexpected. I think I've been painting for long enough, and I'm old enough where there's specific things that I know I want to do in terms of kind of my studio interests. What I do foresee is that going into grad school, an experimentation with media that I haven't had the opportunity. And this goes back to something we were talking about earlier, and that's the idea of like allowing a lot more room for failure. When you have such finite time to work in the studio, you work 40 hours work week, you get maybe 20 to 30 hours in the studio. There's a hesitation to trying out materials and media that you're not as familiar with, because then you begin to feel like you're wasting that time. You don't have the luxury of time. And so I believe the first thing I'll do in grad school there is to start experimenting in sculpture. So I really want, and I'm thinking about, expanding these works into sculpture. And then I also have aspirations of like, okay, well, if I was to go into digital technology, if I was go into virtual spaces, if I was, to go into more installation, how might these works and the themes I'm dealing with expand outward into those areas?
Yeah, I think that's something that I went through when I went through grad school too. I felt like I needed to flex all the resources that I had. So when I was at the Art Institute of Chicago, I was checking out video equipment and doing all kinds of video art and like editing, like getting all into all that stuff. And it was really fascinating, but at the same time it was like a recognition of things that like I liked and things that I didn't like, and the frustrations, and like how to deal with the frustrations of like overcoming the things that you don't know. I think with painting, for example, like when I got into using Galkin and stretching out the oil and moving it and like feeling how like it would reduce the friction and allow for the carrying of the paint a longer distance, like that became so satisfying. That when I was doing video editing work and I was cutting and copying and putting together and I was adding sound, it was illuminating and it was satisfying, but it was nowhere near as fun as like the satisfaction that I got out of painting. But with sculpture, I think one of the things that like I can say directly, because my work is very physical, is that I get the most joy out of cutting wood. Like cutting wood is the thing that makes my art sing in a way that I can't even like describe. But then like once I have the surface and I have to paint it, that's like the frustration of painting that comes through, and I can only quench that frustration once I apply paint. And that has like, I love hate, and I love hating painting. Remember that?
Yeah.
Because I think I'll always hate painting, but I love painting.
Yeah.
Because
No, yeah, and and I think even if I were to go into other material, I'm probably, when I look at the kind of painting, the kind of sculpture and maybe even installation art that I look at, it always, and it's such a vague term, I guess, unless you know it, it always feels painterly. So like, lately I've been looking at a lot of Bay Area artists, funk, kind of scene, and looking at like Robert Arneson's sculptures,
those ceramic things are so wonderful.
Yeah, and so then I start, so it starts to get a little easier when I start to find artists that I have an affinity with already. And so I'm thinking about like his Hiroshima kind of series when he was doing like the burnt, charred heads. He's mostly known for the humorous work, which I also love. Because
That's
it's
real
usually,
relevant.
huh?
That Hiroshima work is really relevant for this.
Yeah. But even his humorous work has a dark, kind of sinister, playful, kind of thing to it. But even like an artist like Jessica Stockholder, when I look at her installations, to me those are like paintings. They're not, even though they're made with objects and so forth. To me, I look at those and for some reason I read them as paintings.
Let me just chime in for a second, right? So I think we've been talking for close to an hour now.
Yeah.
And I'm not 100% certain with this Instagram Live. I think it has like a 1 hour kill switch, so let's just be aware of that. But
Yeah.
if we're gonna end on something, I wanted to ask you what your thoughts about painting and humor are at this moment, because I think that there's always this conversation with other people when they look at paintings. It's like, what is humorous in a painting? How does humor play a part with pigment on canvas?
Yeah, I think that's that's a tough question because, humor varies from person to person. For example, I have a painting that I did in 2017 where I had started a series, and this is largely because, and it's not that I'm personally suicidal or anything, just to start, but I think most people at some point they think about like, whether it's a flash, like what if I just drove off this bridge right now, like things like, these kind of weird like impulses, and so suicide is something that we take culturally very seriously. You don't talk about it a lot, and it's kind of to me, it's one of those things where I think you can approach it with a certain kind of humor. And so I did a self-portrait. Again, this was starting a series of self-portrait suicides in which it's suicide by shotgun. And so to me, the painting is very humorous in the way that I painted it. The subject matter, if you think about it, not as humorous, but in terms of the way the figuration was handled, I thought it was humorous. But then, of course, you have I think humorous things that you do in a painting that only other painters might notice.
You know what? I'll put another reference out there when it comes to suicide. I remember that Dana Schutz was talking about how this man was recurrent in her paintings, and that this man in this island just dies in all these kinds of ways, and she would just think about like these weird ways. So it's like the man eating his face or whatever, right? So then she made a painting of a man eating his face, and it's directly that reference of like a suicidal idea, but then like through this humorous bent, like how that's depicted.
If there's earlier you asked about Dana Schutz, if there's anything that I think I've gotten out of Dana Schutz, and I think it's she kind of lends you freedom to be as imaginative as you want. A lot of her paintings are premised just based on like a funny phrase, a funny Google search autofill, things like that, where she allows these to be the catalyst for then making, a painting that then is going to be formally. But on the same note, it's funny that you brought her up, because I'm thinking about, when you look at her work, just in her, like, even if it's not a humorous image, right? Just in her color palette and her